preparing. Brilliant. Okay. I think and I hope that we are now live. So welcome everyone. Really glad if you're joining us. And we're also recording today. So if you aren't able to join on the live stream or for all of it, then we are recording and we'll be able to share it afterwards as well. So welcome, I'm Lydia Paris, the host for the Fireside chat today with Dr. Michael Fox, and also founder of the Future Works, which I'll tell you a bit more about at the end. But yes, welcome to this chat. And Michael's kindly joined me for this discussion around particularly his work and research for Imperial College London about equity, diversity, inclusion, and whether social justice can from the top can trickle down, particularly in the context of higher education teaching. So a bit of background, I went to university with Michael at Oxford University, and I always thought of him as a really super smart physicist, which he is. But what I love most is when people who are super smart and passionate about a subject are also really effective teachers. So Michael and I met again recently at an event, and I think I was banging on, really putting my foot in my mouth about how when I was at university, the teaching experience was really variable, and the impact that had on me as a student when the teaching I felt wasn't kind of playing to my learning needs. And that's when Michael actually piped up and said, actually, I'm a senior teaching fellow now at Imperial College. So, and then we got into this conversation about teaching and some of the great work that Michael's been doing. So, yeah, the care and attention that he clearly takes to his approach to teaching and the experience for students is brilliant. And that's what's led to this event. So I think, and particularly exploring EDI in this academic field and the discipline of physics in particular, which has traditionally been viewed as quite not diverse and perhaps a little bit exclusive, perhaps. I think it's amazing that he's doing this work. So I'm really excited for the discussion today. So it's intended as a casual fireside chat, and really up for any questions that might come through for people that are joining on the live stream, and we'll get to those. So my first question really is just to hear a bit more from you, Michael, about you, who you are, and yeah, what's brought you to the position you're at now at Imperial.
Great, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so just in terms of how I got to where I am now, so I did a PhD in theoretical plasma physics, looking at nuclear fusion stuff. But then after that, moved into secondary school teaching physics in London. And through that, so that's the education side of things, how that started, and moved, but then got more interested into the research of education and why we teach things the way that we teach things, and did a postdoc in the US at the University of Colorado in Boulder for a couple of years before getting this job at Imperial as a senior teaching fellow.
Yeah, that's a winding journey. And so what, just for people who may not be aware, what does a teaching fellow do, and kind of what's driving you? What made you want to take that role?
It's a very sort of Imperial specific job title. So a teaching fellow is kind of like a university lecturer, but doesn't have a research field in sort of physics, like traditional physics research. Is mainly employed to do teaching, but we're like in the first 3 years at Imperial, I had time brought out to do research on education. So um, that's where this work that we're going to talk about came from, because it was sort of like incentivized, as we will talk about, through a like institutional strategy, and that's actually where that money came from to employ me in that role.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. And so is that what led to you doing this research and this paper then? Because I was
yeah,
going to, what was the impetus for doing the research? What was the motivation for doing it?
yeah. So where it came from. So when I first started, uh, there's lots of interest, as you touched on already, about like increasing diversity within physics. So in physics is sort of well known as having a low representation of women, low representation of ethnic minority students as well. It's like, okay, what can we do about this? And one thing that I wanted to do when I first started was like, well, okay, this this is not a problem with the students necessarily, because they come in, they stay for 3 or 4 years, and then they leave. This is an issue to do with like the institution itself and the people here already, and the people here are the ones that can make change. So let's try and understand that situation. So let's go and talk to them. And this paper, which is builds off the work of Martin Kingsbury and Camille Candico-Howson, who are both professors of higher education at Imperial, um, who started this work like analyzing their institutional change efforts. So it was a good opportunity to then go, okay, let's take this and use it, use this model they have to go and talk to academic staff in the physics department and say like, okay, there was this change effort a few years ago, so it started in 2017. Like, what's the impact on, did it work?
Yeah. Okay, great. And so that's then what the paper is about. So I suppose first off, before we dive into your thoughts and exploring and discussing a bit, could you just walk us through what the headlines were from the paper?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, just give us that summary.
Yeah. So what we did was an interview of 10 people, seven of which were academic staff. And so that's about 10% of the staff in the department, or slightly less actually. And so clearly we're not going to capture everybody through that sampling. We just want to get a picture from different points. And really were trying to like just capture the whole experience of this curriculum review process, which is how the institution embedded this change that they wanted through their strategy, which the strategy had like four aspects of it, which was like assessment, reform, active learning, diversity and inclusion, which is the one we're interested in, and digital and technology enhanced learning. And the other three, sort of on paper, we saw sort of people were engaging with that, but not really with the diversity and inclusion part. So we're like, the question was like, what happened there? Why was the diversity and inclusion part of the curriculum not there? And from talking to people, we've basically figured out that there's three aspects to this. One was the definition of curriculum. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean to a physicist compared to educational researchers who had like proposed it in the first place? And really found that there was two different ideas there. And that's why it didn't really go like, I don't really know what EDI means in my curriculum because, okay, I could talk in my lecture about, the few minority people who did some physics in the past. Is it content? Do I have to do that? But I don't know what else it could be like. Um, then the other part is to sort of do with power structures within the university and like seeing positioning like the department as opposed to the central administration, and seeing and that being like the mediation between the two, kind of like, okay, what can we do? What do we not have to do? Or if we don't understand what this thing is, do we have to do it? And trying to like negotiate that. And the final part was to do with who actually has control of the curriculum. And it's really individual lecturers um, who go, right, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, which was sort of like a nice thing because we did find that people were sort of doing like EDI things without realizing it.
Mm, yeah, great. And what it on that latter point, what kind of things were individual teachers doing in that respect? What kind of practices were they employing?
So there was a few people who were going, okay, yes, I'm putting I'm talking about diverse people in the history of physics and deliberately raising that up. That's like, okay, I want to make sure that people know about these things. There were some other people, but then this sort of didn't really get reported back up the chain, these things that people were doing like on the ground. Um, and then there was other people who actually were um, sort of figuring out they was so like there's a quote in the paper which I'll read actually because it's like one of the nice things which we found. Just find it. Um, yeah, okay, here it is. It said, I don't think this thing was presented as any aspect of EDI, but with hindsight, this thing is an EDI thing. It may not have been anybody saying from above, like, we need to do this for equality and inclusion reasons. It was things like saying, well, we've got people with very different backgrounds. Some of them have never done this thing before, so probably we should adapt. Like I'm adding on here, probably we should adapt what we're doing to account for them. So it's sort of seeing EDI not as content, as like, okay, how do we arrange things in a way? How do we decide what to do so that then everybody gets like an equal chance, equal experience um, to access this education that we're providing?
Yeah, yeah. So it's making that mindset shift in how in the delivery and the setup and the methods used in the teaching,
Yeah.
uh, which they're just kind of improvising and experimenting with themselves.
Yeah, but I think the motivation behind that is really like this idea of fairness. And I think that for physicists in like a physics like community, like the idea of fairness, and some might call it meritocracy in some ways, that's like it's quite a strong um sort of discipline thing. It's like the thing should be fair. And um that that is like a nice way of thinking about it. So people were motivated to do it by that. But then actually, if you look at it from an EDI lens, it's the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's something that's really important to consider with any kind of institutional change is to consider what the your audience or your workforce, your team, the place that they're coming from and the mindset that they have. So when I work with teams on culture change, it's important to consider the profession that they're in and the particular assumptions and beliefs that come along with that. So, a physics profession is very different to the kind of starting point that people are coming from, perhaps in the arts or in a corporate setting. So that playing to the beliefs, the assumptions, the needs that your people have is really important. So I like how it highlighted that in the paper. Um, what were the things that surprised you from the findings? Is there anything that really made you think, oh, I wasn't expecting that to come out?
I think it's really sort of related to the quote that you said. It's this kind of thing. It's like people were doing this anyway. I would hoping that people were doing it, but it's was sort of surprising that like there's this like the loop wasn't closed in the sense that like there's this top-down agenda of like we should do EDI that got lost somewhere on the way down into like the lower on the ground in the hierarchy of things, but then it was still there, people were still doing it, and but then it wasn't going back up again, and because the language used is different. Um, and sort of have if you kind of want to do these things properly, I guess you need to have somebody to like make that link and go, right, I want to like sort of has disciplinary knowledge and goes, okay, this is what they're doing, and actually I need to translate that to report that back. Um, to go like, okay, people are doing good things and they should be rewarded for doing good things. But then if there's not people in between who recognize that, and go, well, actually, yeah, this is what we want to do. And then you can promote it and go, actually, this is uh, promote it in the disciplinary language as well. Because otherwise you get people switching off.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a barrier that's not been addressed, perhaps, which inadvertently gets in the way of things from progressing and succeeding.
Yeah.
Were there any other barriers that you identified during the process when it comes to these kind of top-down initiatives and handing them over to departments? What else gets in the way there?
I mean, there is always the problem of time. And I think that's one of the key. You can't expect this to happen if you don't put resources into it. Like, um, there was like there was some money and time put in so people could like sort of take a step back. Is what one of the interviewees said. They did get some money so they could go think, okay, what we're doing, what are we doing here, and design something sort of appropriate for the current intake of students. And that's one thing, like our student intake has changed drastically since over like the last 30 years. So we need to adapt the ways that we do things. But
Yeah,
yeah, that's one of the major challenges, and sort of appropriately allocating resources for that,
yeah,
which then is relates to the implementation of stuff. Is that as it's like there's this power structures, it's you don't want to be seen as like imposing it from top down, because then people start disengaging from it. So having some top level policy and things that can promote things that people would be like people who are interested can engage with. But if you want to get everybody on board, then you need to like really go in at the ground level and talk to the discipline that way.
yeah. Yeah. And I think we were talking just before we came on, weren't we, about this idea of the two approaching it from both sides, the kind of top-down leadership, which is brilliant. I mean, it's great that there is that top level engagement. Sorry, that top team interest, awareness, and momentum behind things. But it needs to be coupled with that engagement from the ground up to really understand your context, how it's going to work where you are, and bring it to life at the ground level.
Yeah.
And so what should be done differently then? How can we support this bridging of the gap?
Well, I think one of the things is that these things always take time, and it's a longer time than you expect. And it can be easy for people to sort of like switch off from it or go, right, my day-to-day job is this thing, so I don't have time to engage with this stuff. But then it can make your like in the long term, it can make your job easier and better, and you're more motivated. So and also yeah, realizing so like depending on the institution, so universities are notoriously slow at doing change. Um, like having that time scale sort of thought out like, okay, what is the actual sort of direction? What do we want to achieve when? And you're thinking like, maybe it's decades time scale in this institution that this is really going to happen. Given the life cycle of like going from a student all the way through to a professor, it's a long time. It's a generational kind of challenge, specifically for EDI. And then that is like a adds into more like a sociological challenge. Like what how do our big question is like how do we get a more diverse group of physicists? That's a bigger question than sort of what this paper's about, but it's kind of like you have to look outside of the institution as well for that one. Sort of that was a bit of a ramble.
No, that there's some great points in there. So it's firstly kind of seeing it as a long-term shift that requires concerted planning, resource, and that kind of top down as well as bottom up um,
and I think I'll add that it's really like having those policies in place and sort of like this the sort of representation within physics is more like a um sort of it's it's a diagnostic tool. You can go, right, do we have good policies and structures in place to support the people that work here? And if we do, we should, in the long run, get a more diverse and group of people working in physics.
Yes.
Um, so that it's like a we can use it to test like how well we're doing.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, having the kind of infrastructure around you to support all of this as well, this change. Um, and I like the point you made about looking outside of the the field or the industry for inspiration and for uh, best practice and yeah, to kind of support the evolution of the process that they need to go through. I always think that's a good place to start as well, which is easily overlooked. Um, and so what advice would you give to other teaching fellows or professors or people in your kind of teaching position? What can they do differently, regardless of how much is coming down from the top, from the university, in their practice to make things more equitable and more inclusive?
I'd say the first thing to do is talk to people and talk to students and talk to everybody and just find out what the situation is. And then I there's for like institutional change, there's like the models of departmental action teams, which comes from the US, which is actually a specific physics, what started in physics, um, and where you get all the stakeholders together who are interested in doing this and making some change. They identify the change and make sure that it's like actually achievable, and then hopefully, depending on the situation, is there's some resource available to like actually implement that change. But it's really like what is most important to the people in that institution at that moment in time. And so it's really like pulling together people from the grassroots really. That's um that's my number one piece of advice. Like um and there are like sort of small pots of money from like Institute of Physics and things like this that can help with these things, I believe.
Great. Yeah, that's good. And I love that advice. And do you know anywhere, is there any examples from perhaps the UK or beyond where you've seen good examples of this happening?
Yeah, so I'd say so like at the University of Hull in the physics department there, the Brad Gibson's the head of department, and uh, there they've increased the representation of women in their undergraduate physics course a lot by engaging with local schools. But I mean, the University of Hull is very different from Imperial College, but they've adapted and looked at their environment and what their goals are and acted and achieved some very impressive results there. So I'll encourage people to go and look up.
Yeah, yeah. Nice. Thank you. And just before, I mean, we're coming up to 2 o'clock. But before we go, is there one, if you had to leave the audience with one key reflection from you, what would that be?
think it would be really this thing about communication, and it can be really easy to like um, sort of be in your own little bubble of like, okay, this is what all these words mean, this is what stuff, and then people you go out to some other department and they're like, I don't know what that means, just because it's not familiar. So you can be very familiar with stuff uh, and just assume other people know about it, even like well-educated people. um, so like listening to others and listening to what their things important, and then sort of translating that into okay, this is what it means in my context. How do these work together? I think that's probably the number one thing I'd say.
Mm, I love that. Thank you. And I always, yeah, I think communication, working on things at the moment where it's clear that communications is what's needed, and actually thinking through a strategy and an approach to that to empower people, because communication is all about empowerment of people, isn't it? And you can't have one without the other. So um yeah, I don't think you can underplay how important that is. So thank you. I'm going to share the link to Michael's paper in the chat so that people can read that in full when they want, and it is a really great read. And thank you so much, Michael. I'll do a final thank you at the end. I'll just give people a very brief overview of what the Future Works is, just in case they don't know, before we close. But yeah, so the Future Works is a consultancy and organization that supports you to enhance the performance and the culture of your organization by providing culture change support. So that's what we're here to do. And we work with all kinds of organization, industry, sector to help understand culture, redesign and shift culture into a more helpful direction to support organizational aims. So yeah, always up for chatting and hearing and discussing culture challenges. And we do events like this with guests to kind of talk about some of the topics and the interesting issues that go on in the culture space. So yeah, thank you, Michael, for joining and for sharing about this research and your insights. And I think it's really helpful to people. And although it's in a very specific setting for you in this case, I think the principles and the learning applies much wider. And I think that we've heard some kind of easily transferable insights from what you talked about today. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Great. All right, well, we'll close there. And thank you for joining, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event.